Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of International Law Chats, a podcast from the American branch of the International Law Association, or ABILA from short. I'm Alison MacDonald, a barrister at Essex Court Chambers in London and a fellow at All Souls College in Oxford.
And I'm Milena Sterio, a professor of international law at Cleveland State University College of Law and also managing director at the Public International Law and Policy Group.
And I am Chiara Giorgetti. I'm a professor of international law at Richmond Law School and a senior fellow at the International Claims and Reparation Project at Columbia Law School.
And today we are excited to be chatting to Rez Gardi, a very special guest. We will discuss her career in more depth in a moment, but by way of a short introduction, Rez is an international human rights lawyer and advocate in the global refugee leadership movement. She's admitted to the bar in New York and New Zealand. And among her many academic qualifications, she studied law at Harvard as a Fulbright scholar, and I believe was the first person of Kurdish heritage to do so. Rez is the co-founder and co-director of RSEAT, which stands for Refugees Seeking Equal Access at the Table. This is the only global refugee-led organization working to embed refugee co-leadership in state delegations and policy processes at the United Nations. She's currently based in New York, and she works to bridge refugee advocacy efforts between Geneva and New York. She also serves as co-director of the Center for Asia Pacific Refugee Studies at the University of Auckland and is the founder of Empower, a refugee-led organization advancing educational access for refugee youth. She sits on the UNHCR's advisory board, and she contributes as an expert to the Wilson Centre's Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative. And finally, just a couple of weeks ago, she was appointed a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit in the King's Birthday Honours List for her services to refugees and human rights advocacy. So warm congratulations, Rez, for that latest honour. So I wanted to start with a bit of background. People obviously come into law, including human rights law, in lots of different ways. And I know from reading some of your interviews online that your path to becoming a lawyer focused on the rights of refugees has got very personal origins. Could you share with our listeners some of that background and the path that has brought you to do the work that you do today?
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here with you all to have this conversation. Yes, the path to law was very personal for me. I was born as a refugee in Pakistan after my parents had fled Iran, where they were refugees from the Kurdish movement and where their lives were in danger because of their human rights activism. And my family were also survivors of the genocide against the Kurdish people. And so I grew up with a lot of stories about my parents and my grandparents' survival, how many times they risked their lives to stand up for what they believed in. As the daughter of human rights activists, I knew the words for justice and human rights before I even knew many other words. And so growing up in this refugee camp environment, surrounded by instability and fear, the kind of atrocities seeing on a daily basis, children dying from preventable diseases, the hunger strike, witnessing peaceful protesters being beaten and members of our community being imprisoned for advocating for their rights. I grew up around all this, this context of human rights denial and stories about injustice. And at the same time, I also grew up around stories of resilience and hope and people fighting for human rights. And so growing up, I wanted to do something to contribute to the stories that I was seeing around me, to the experiences that I had as a child and those of my community members. But I couldn't necessarily do the same kind of work that my parents had, fighting for human rights and being activists on the front lines. And so I was thinking about what other ways can I contribute using the skills that I have and the obviously educational opportunities that I had once I was resettled to New Zealand. And that's what led me to law. I wanted to understand the power of law to change the status quo, to fight for a better system for all, and how it could be used to dismantle justice, to protect, to create change. And so that's really what led me to pursue a career in law, to try to help build a society that we can be proud of, one that is fair, that is just, and to work with people directly to access what they believe justice is for them.
I mean, it's a really incredible sort of journey that you've taken to the work that you do today. And I wanted to start maybe by thinking about the current political climate. So in many countries around the world, including the United States and the United Kingdom, where I'm sitting today, there is significant hostility to the idea of refugees. So it seems to me from the media, from press, from the general climate, that refugees are often portrayed as other, and politicians often argue that protecting the rights of refugees in some way takes away from the rest of the population of a country. So it's a kind of zero-sum game. So I'd be really interested to hear from your advocacy work, and we'll obviously speak more about the details of the work that you do. What strategies do you think are the most effective to counter these kind of narratives of refugees as other and also as not contributing to the countries that they come to?
I think one of the most powerful strategies is trying to shift the narrative from, this fear or even one of pity that we see in other circumstances. So it's either fair people to be feared or people that we must pity. And I think the most powerful strategy is to reject both of those and to instead focus on the agency and leadership and contributions of refugee communities. Too often refugees are spoken about but rarely listened to. But when refugees lead advocacy efforts and programming themselves, when they're seen not just as recipients of aid, but as active contributors, as decision makers, I think that changes the conversation. And importantly, showing the kind of contributions that refugees bring to the societies that they're part of, that they come with solutions, with innovative ideas, with hope, and with the motivation to contribute to the betterment of the society around them. And I think that is really important. And another important strategy is the intersectional coalition building. I think connecting refugee rights to broader human rights struggles, racial justice, gender equality, climate action. So it's clear that these are not just isolated issues, but part of a shared fight for dignity and for equity. Because I think it is really true that the quote that how we treat some of our most vulnerable, marginalized communities is really a reflection of the society that we are. And so really connecting these movements and how, one movement can help support and build the other, I think is really important. And then lastly, I think this storytelling is really important, humanizing refugees through their lived experience, but without sense oversimplification. It can be really effective in shaping and shifting public perception. But I think that also needs to go beyond storytelling to recognize the expertise that refugees bring to show that, we're not just the stories of our displacement and our suffering, but actually also all the stories of how we contribute across different aspects of societies, whether it's, through being part of communities and the kind of friendships and projects that we build in partnership with our communities, the economic aspects that we contribute to, and so many other ways as well. So I think it's a combination of all of those, but really shifting away from this kind of beneficiaries of aid narrative that we see too often.
Thank you very much, as this is very, very interesting. And I agree on changing this view of refugees. And I know that an important strand of your work, to go a little bit more on some of the specific of your work, including with RCEAT, involves trying to embed specifically refugees' representation in state delegations and policy processes at the UN. What have you found to be the most effective ways of doing this? And do you find that states in the UN are open to this? And what are the challenges that you have found also?
I think the most effective approach has been for us to demonstrate that refugee participation can lead to better outcomes. So as the name of our organization, Refugees Seeking Equal Access at the Table, the mandate is clear, but the different ways of doing that is what goes on behind the scenes. So we're trying to bring this alternative reality that, yes, the moral right is there, that people should be engaged in the decisions that impact their lives. That's the principled approach. But unfortunately, that kind of argument doesn't always work with a lot of states. And so they want to see, why should we include refugees in these kind of conversations? What is there to gain? And so focusing also on the strategy aspect, the fact that many countries are investing in different programs and policies that can fail because they're not designed with the people who they're supposed to impact at the center of it. And so there can be a mismatch between the programs and the policies and the reality on the ground. And so for us, we're trying to show why refugee participation is more strategic, how it can lead to better, more impactful outcomes, more legitimate outcomes, and that the impacts are more in line with what the needs are at the grassroots level. Refugees bring really deep contextual knowledge to these processes. And so for us, it's bringing that. And you asked, are states and UN open to this? I think that over the last few years, there's been a recognition of the kind of values that refugees bring in theory, but now we're focusing on what does that mean in practice? How do we move away from tokenistic practices to more co-designed true partnership models?
Thank you. This is, again, very interesting. And I wonder, I'd like to follow up specifically on specific states, because, of course, each state has different priorities and different circumstances. And on the subject of the United Nations also specifically, I know that recently you addressed an event at the Security Council with the candidate members for the upcoming elections to the Council, and you addressed the right of refugees on behalf of the Zagros Human Rights Center. And the candidates for the Security Council are, of course, a very diverse range of states, including Bahrain, Colombia, the DRC, Latvia, and Liberia. How do you address these differences and range of states like that? And what did you feel specifically was their response to your communications?
Yeah, this kind of intervention on at the Security Council is an example of some of the more forward-facing parts of the advocacy work, and they signify key moments where we want to make our particular position or statements on record, so that that's easier to follow up behind the scenes. But I would say that those moments are a very small percentage of the amount of work that goes in working with state behind the scenes, the kind of meetings that we have to have, discussing the particular agendas for those states, what is in their interest, how can we get them to engage. It also means that we have to do a lot of specific research and work on each individual state to understand where the kind of points are where we can offer a solution based on the kind of work that we're doing, where we can maybe compromise and have a middle ground, and then where there are just divergent views where we're not likely to get the state to come on board with what we're saying. But I think it's very rarely straightforward. It's very complex. Navigating these complex political agendas, their competing priorities, these entrenched power dynamics, and especially when we're raising issues that challenge the status quo. And I give one example. In the lead up to the Global Compact for refugees, there was about 2 years of behind the scenes work going on. And I was part of a coalition of refugee advocates and leaders who were pushing for particular paragraphs to be included in the Global Compact for refugees. So over a sustained period across 2 years, various different meetings, late nights, different proposals and drafts being presented. In the end, we were able to get just about one paragraph of all the different versions that we put forward that reflected in a compromise the kind of language we were hoping to achieve. And many of the other proposals that we put forward were just outright rejected by states. And so there is a lot of work that people don't see. We may see the statement at a large international kind of UN convening, but all the behind the scenes work that I think is probably the 99% of the work is very much unseen.
Now, Rez, if you don't mind, I would like to shift gears a little bit and ask you a different question, which is about the youth advocacy side of your work. This is something that I know you have been deeply involved in. And I know that, for example, back in 2019, you were awarded the Outstanding Youth Delegate Award at the UN Youth Assembly. And we do see a lot of incredible youth advocacy around the world on issues including human rights, and of course, climate change, which is an issue where the current young bear a particular burden. So what do you see as the most effective way of amplifying young voices and perspectives?
It's a great question. I think amplifying young voices means more than putting young people on a particular panel or inviting them to speak at an ad hoc or one-off event. I think it requires a real shift in how institutions can work with youth, especially in the co-design processes, to help them be involved in processes that shape agendas. Many of the young people that I work with through Empower, who are from marginalized and forcibly displaced backgrounds, have really sharp instinct and great leadership potential. What they often lack is the access to the right spaces. They lack resources for their participation and engagement in these processes, and mentorship from people who can really guide them into these right spaces. So at Empower, our organization, we focus on creating long-term meaningful opportunities, and we focus specifically on mentoring their leadership development and then their ongoing engagement in policy processes, and trying to encourage co-design processes where the other party is open to that, to bring them in early in the process so that it's not a predetermined agenda that they're then invited to contribute to, but actually they're part of it from the very early programming and design. And I think those are the most effective ways to amplify young voices and to encourage them to be part of these processes. And they're really effective in investing in then not just their growth, but also the autonomy and their agency, which I think is very crucial.
And I believe that you have also a lot of experience representing children and young people in immigration courts in the United States. Can you give us a flavor of the types of challenges that you face as a lawyer trying to assist such vulnerable clients?
Yeah, as you can imagine, the challenges in the system are significant and growing tremendously right now. Many of the children and young people I've represented and are representing now have fled really unimaginable violence and challenges, only to face now a legal system that is incredibly complex, adversarial, and fundamentally not designed for children and young people. There's no guaranteed right to a lawyer in the US immigration court. So unless they're connected with pro bono legal aid, they're often left to navigate it completely alone. And even when they do have representation, the process can be really re-traumatizing. Many are afraid to speak. They don't know who to trust. So that building trust process is really critical. And, and it's compounded by a number of issues, the language barriers, the trauma, and also the fear of authority. In the current climate, I think this fear of authority is escalating. We're seeing cases where people are being detained or even arrested in or near courthouses while they're trying to lawfully pursue their immigration cases. And so it sends a really chilling message that seeking protection can itself be dangerous. And I think this is, as lawyers, this is one of the most uncomfortable and most difficult challenges when you're trying to represent clients who are trying to go through the appropriate legal channels, and then there's risk of arrest on that side. For the children, and in my pro bono cases, I only represent unaccompanied children and minors. This challenge that they're now facing is unbearable. On the one hand, they're told by lawyers around them and their trusted community members that they should follow the legal processes. On the other hand, they see people being punished for trying to do that. And as a lawyer, then we're not just facing navigating the legal arguments and the challenges, we're also trying to constantly build trust and create some sense of safety in a system that I think can feel very hostile. And yeah, it's a very difficult tension for the young people, very heavy responsibility for us as lawyers right now, but a very deeply necessary one.
You mentioned the dangers that refugees have faced, the trauma that they've experienced in the journeys that they have to take. One thing that has been a really big political issue in Europe for some years is the fact that people are making very dangerous journeys by boat, for example, from Libya to Italy, from the coast of France to the UK. And there are lots of human rights issues and cases about the Italian Coast Guard, for example, pushing boats back to Libya. We've seen recent press reports of the French police slashing inflatable boats on the beaches of France. And images like this, for me, raise the question. It seems to me that the position of a lot of state parties to the Refugee Convention, which is most states, it is that while they may technically have to grant asylum to certain people, if they can get to that country, those states at the same time can make it as hard as possible for refugees to actually get to safe countries in the first place. And so I guess my question is whether you think that international law as it stands does enough to make the right to asylum actually practical and effective. And if not, what legal or policy changes would you want to see on this issue?
The legal framework itself, we talk about the 1951 Refugee Convention, I believe is robust. It clearly affirms the rights and the state's obligations to protect those fleeing. And so I believe the problem is not with the law, but rather, as also you've alluded to, it's the failure to implement and uphold those conventions. And we are absolutely seeing states in practice increasingly undermine this right. These growing efforts to criminalize people for the very act of seeking asylum through detention, surveillance, legal penalties, and all these deterrent strategies. I think one of the structural weaknesses or areas that I think would be beneficial to open up and discuss about the different avenues is the lack of a dedicated enforcement or monitoring body for the Refugee Convention. Unlike some of the other international treaties, such as the ICCPR and others, there's no treaty body to assess compliance or monitor accountability. UNHCR holds a supervisory mandate, but in practice, I think its ability to enforce any kind of standard is very limited as an operational agency and one that relies entirely on state funding and cooperation to carry out its work. I think UNHCR has to walk a very delicate line, one that has to prioritize access to those states and diplomacy over accountability. And so I think there's a significant gap between, the law on paper and the reality on the ground. So we need to think about how can we reinforce through stronger accountability mechanisms or oversight, more robust civil society engagement and renewed political commitment to international protection systems. I think right now, with the kind of climate we're in, those are very challenging policies to consider or changes. And so a lot relies on domestic enforcement and how refugee law is enforced within the courts. And I think that there's been strong examples of both civil society and the legal community and also the judiciaries in certain countries stepping up and saying this is in conflict with what the law says internationally and what we've ratified domestically. And I think we need more examples like that to put pressure on the domestic systems to uphold the protections that refugees are entitled to under refugee law.
Thank you. And actually, to follow up on your reference and your work on the domestic litigation, when it comes to advancing the law and policy in relation to refugees, do you see litigation as having a significant role, or is it maybe a matter more for advocacy and campaigning, or is it a mixture of the two?
Yeah, it's definitely a mix of both. I think litigation can be a very powerful tool to enforce rights and challenge these unlawful practices and also to set legal precedents. And as I've said, especially in domestic settings, we need these court cases to challenge the kind of practices that their states are engaging in. But as we know, litigation can be very slow moving and it is often reactive and it can be limited to specific cases or jurisdictions. So I think it needs to be in combination with advocacy that can be flexible, forward looking and systems oriented. I think through advocacy, we can also build coalitions, put pressure on our elected representatives and put pressure on the kind of structures that we believe need to stand up in a way that litigation, I think, alone cannot achieve. And so through my work, whether, it's been supporting legal cases or the participation of refugees in the advocacy and representation within the UN systems, I've seen that legal action is most effective when it's also in combination with sustained advocacy efforts and that these different angles are in communication and strategizing together. So they're not just working in silos, but rather the litigation is supported and informed by those with lived experience, those at the grassroots organizing level, and survivors and victims of the very systems that we're trying to change.
And we have one more final question for you today. Based on this amazing journey that you have had in your career so far, what advice would you have for people who want to have careers in international law and human rights, but who perhaps feel like they do not fit into this stereotype of what an international lawyer ought to look like? What advice would you have?
I think my advice would be strongly, don't try to fit the stereotype. I think we must redefine it. The legal profession, especially in international law and human rights, looks and is very different to perhaps what it was some years ago. And so we need to reflect also the range of different kind of skills, perspective, and experiences that this kind of work requires. Law is not just about courtroom litigation or formal arguments. There are so many different ways to practice law, especially in the international human rights field. And I think some of the most impactful legal work can happen through a combination of different skills, whether it's people interviewing and working directly with communities and survivors on the ground, documenting evidence, whether they're engaging with communities in drafting particular policies or working alongside civil society. I think there is a lot of different ways that we can practice law, and this work demands, I think, empathy, analytical thinking, cultural fluency, creativity, diplomacy, all skills that I think may not be the traditional skills that we think of when we think of lawyers, but so many other skills as well. So we do need, I think, young lawyers who bring very different life experiences, different approaches, different skills. There's no one path. And I think that the success of the field depends on those who will ask different questions, see things differently, and push us in ways that maybe we didn't think of before. So yeah, challenge that kind of system. I don't think I fit any of the stereotypes of what people might think when they think about lawyers either, but here we are.
So to wrap things up, huge thanks to you, Rez, for taking the time to join us today, being so generous in sharing your insights on these issues. I know we've all really enjoyed our conversation, and if the listeners have too, you can join us on the first Monday of every month for more international law chats. And finally, we wanted to congratulate our fantastic podcast producer, Freya Doughty-Wagner, on her recent appointment as ABILA's Chief Operating Officer. So congratulations, Freya.